Thank you for joining us today to discuss strategies to increase access and success for underrepresented students in CTE and STEM. I'm Brandy Holton from Education Northwest, where I'm a researcher focused on post-secondary and career readiness. Dr. Sandra Stacklis from RTI International will be moderating the Q&A at the end of today's webinar. The first half of this video is a re-recording of a live presentation held on June 15th, 2017. We hope that you find the information provided in today's webinar to be valuable to your specific context within the field of education. REL Northwest is operated by Education Northwest, which has been serving the 5-state region from our headquarters in Portland, Oregon for more than 50 years. REL Northwest is one of 10 regional educational labs funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. We work with stakeholders in Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington to assist them in their use of data systems to conduct and support high-quality research and evaluation focused on regional priorities, and to help educational policymakers and practitioners incorporate data and research into everyday decision-making. I'd like to introduce Dr. Ben Williams, our featured speaker for today. Ben is the Director of Special Projects for the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity, where he is one of the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity's lead trainers around the country. He was also part of the team that developed NAPE's Program Improvement Process for Equity Model. Before joining NAPE, Dr. Williams spent nearly 12 years at Columbus State Community College in Ohio, where he coordinated the secondary career technical recruitment process and oversaw the Charles D. Perkins grant. In his career, he has worked as a community college and university admissions advisor, an administrator for academic advising, a coordinator for international students, and a teacher in Japan. Williams earned his bachelor's degree in psychology and philosophy from Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts, and his master's in student affairs and higher education, and his PhD in educational policy and leadership, both from The Ohio State University. His primary research interests are student development and racial identity. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you so much, Brandy, and thank you all for joining this recording of our webinar together, and for being a part of this important conversation looking at effective strategies to increase access and success for underrepresented students in career technical education and STEM. So the objectives for today are really to use NAPE's Program Improvement Process for Equity, PIPE, as a framework for continuous improvement focused on access and equity. And what we're going to do is use PIPE to begin a process of exploration of what we know are key factors that lead to the equity gaps that we recognize in CTE and STEM, especially relative to the underrepresentation of women, people of color, students from low-income backgrounds, English language learners, students with disabilities, and others who've been historically underrepresented in STEM through CTE. Uncover and identify where those gaps come from, the reasons for that, so that the strategies that are ultimately implemented are best directed towards mitigating those root causes that may be the key barriers for students' access and success. We're going to use a key concept called micromessages and explore the power of micromessages and their effects on students' perceptions. And I'm going to share with you about 5 to 6 minutes of a YouTube video presented by an incredible thinker, thought leader, writer, and speaker, Chimamanda Adichie, through her YouTube TED Talk called The Danger of the Single Story. So when we switch over to that, stay with it, and then we'll come back together and reflect on and think about how her teachings relate to this conversation, so that we can ultimately affect change and identify effective strategies to increase access and success for students in high-skill, high-wage, high-demand career pathways, especially looking at serving historically underrepresented students in STEM, including Native Americans. and then with the goal to integrate 1 to 2 specific strategies into your own personal or institutional plan for this coming academic year. So I know it's an ambitious set of objectives, but definitely something I want to provide the tools to help you all to do and to provide the framework to guide that work. So let me first tell you a little bit about a mnemonic that we're going to use to help us as we're thinking through this. So radio is a mnemonic that helps us as we think about tuning into micromessages, tuning into the radio being reflecting on bias and stereotypes and how it may affect our students and also our own lenses. Anticipate the impact of decisions, words, and behaviors on individuals with whom we work on a regular basis. It could be students, teachers, fellow administrators, counselors, fellow teachers, family members, community members, etc. Discover and address negative micromessages and identify specific ways to give positive micromessages, which I'll explain a little bit later as we get into this process. And then finally, offer high expectations of our students and provide wise feedback, which is a powerful strategy where an educator helps a student to see that they have high expectations for that student, that they believe they can meet those expectations, and that they will work with them to meet those expectations. So it's building an authentic relationship with those students, helping them to see that they can be successful and working with them to get there. So the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity is the nation's largest professional alliance made up of state agencies, workforce development agencies, individual community colleges, school districts, secondary institutions, business and industry partners, and university partners whose focus is on building educators' capacity to implement effective solutions to increase student access, educational equity, and ultimately workforce diversity. Our work revolves around providing technical assistance to our institutional and state and agency partners through professional development and assistance in the implementation of key legislative mandates such as Perkins and more recently the Every Student Succeeds Act, WIOA. And so we are also involved in public policy and advocacy relative to equity provisions in key education and workforce development legislation, and then also do research and evaluation relative to the effectiveness of our professional development in moving the needle in these key areas of need. Looks like I just lost my webcam and I'm having difficulty in getting it back. So I will continue to try that, but we'll continue to use the audio as we move forward. So NAPE has currently 39 state members. I'm very pleased to welcome our newest state member, the state of Washington, which just officially became a member of NAPE this week. So this map has not yet been updated, but very excited to have Washington join the many states in the Northwest and Western parts of the country that are involved in our work. And if you don't see your state as a state member, I definitely encourage you to connect with colleagues in the state agencies to encourage the involvement in this work. So what we're going to use to guide our process today is this model called PIPE, the Program Improvement Process for Equity. And as I was beginning to describe, this is a 5-module process, the first being organizing a team. So this is everybody who's around the room right now or with whom you might collaborate in this work. To then explore what we know from national trends relative to equity gaps, or we're going to actually start by looking at the demands in certain career pathways and then where there may be equity gaps in the programs of study that lead to those pathways. Then uncover and identify the root causes or key barriers to students' participation in those pathways. Then select specific strategies to mitigate those root causes based on what we know from the evidence and from the research, and then act on those in ways that you can see whether what you're doing is having the desired effect. So as we get into this process, let's think of what are examples of high skill, high wage, and high demand careers in your part of the country, in your state, in your region, and in your local community. So there were a number of ideas were shared as we were going through the webinar when we had nearly 150 people with us. And that included examples around manufacturing, the computer industry, anything from programming to working in network administration, health sciences and different health careers, especially those that may require training up to and through an associate degree and in many cases beyond. Things such as even supply chain management, which where I'm located in the country, I'm in Columbus, Ohio. It's at the intersection of two major highways, Interstate 71 and Interstate 70, and Interstate 75 is just west of here. All of these are major conduits that go all around the country, especially around the Midwest, the East Coast and the Southeast. And so supply chain management is a major area of need. It's a great example of something that people can start at a secondary level, then it articulates into a certificate that can then be stacked on top of other certificates that could lead to an associate degree, ultimately onto a bachelor, and even a master's in logistics if someone chose. And so when we think about all these different careers, we think about the opportunities in these fields, so many of them are really high growth areas, high demand areas, and many of them would definitely be considered high wage. And so if we look at national trends, what we know is that according to Change the Equation and the National Skills Coalition, for example, different sectors will be growing significantly between 2014 and 2024. In fact, computing jobs will grow by 16%, engineering jobs by 11%, advanced manufacturing by 12%, and of all job openings, there will be 51% that will require training at the middle skill level. So when we think about all these jobs, and we think about even a broader spectrum, in case there's actually a report that came out from Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce called Recovery, Job Growth and Education Requirements through 2020, or what's affectionately called Recovery 2020. In looking at 55 million job openings, what percentage of those do you think will require will require a bachelor's degree or higher? So the range of answers are anywhere between 25% to 70 to even 80%. The actual is 35%. So if we think about the remaining 65%, what percentage of those jobs will require some college up to and through an associate degree? So that range is anywhere between another 30% to as much as 60%. And the actual is 30%, which then leaves about 35% of jobs requiring no more than a high school diploma, but those are jobs that lead to minimum wage, no benefits types of positions, not where we want our students. So where we want our students is in these realms here. And so if we look at our current production rate or our current rate of people participating in the educational pipeline, if we continue to have people moving through that pipeline at the current rate, we're going to be 5 million workers short, especially in those areas requiring post-secondary education up to and through an associate degree. And an important tool that we can use in talking with folks about the opportunities through these post-secondary pathways is another report put out by Georgetown Education and the Workforce Development, and that is something called 5 Ways That Pay Along the Way to the BA, which was a report that came out in 2012 that shows how those jobs that require apprenticeships, industry-based certifications, employer-based training, certificates, and associate degrees lead to such a large percentage of those middle-income positions that are in high demand and fall within those high-skill, high-wage, high-demand career pathways leading to jobs that we were talking about before. And the Pathways to Prosperity report that came out just about the same time from Harvard's Graduate School of Education really made the argument that we need to put a lot more emphasis on career technical education and apprenticeships, similar to models from other countries, because we have so many people who have started college, are in major debt because of that, but have no degree to show for it and do not have the skills to enter into these important areas of workforce development. So when we look at some of these industries, for example, engineering and computing, there's even greater demand than there is supply in some of these industries. Yet, when we look at the participation of people in these industries and we look through the lens of gender, women's participation in engineering has stayed flat and even dropped a percentage point in two major areas between 2001 and 2014, and women are still grossly underrepresented in those fields. So in engineering, in 2001, 13% of people in the engineering workforce were women. In 2014, only 12%. In computing, 27% in 2001. In 2014, 26%. In advanced manufacturing, it stayed flat at 10%. In the graphic that you see below that, the top blue line shows the working age population of African Americans and Latinos in the U.S. over the course of 2001 to 2015. And then below that is the participation of African Americans and Latinos in those same workforce areas. So the top line is in red for advanced manufacturing, ranging from about 15% to staying at about 15% over that 10-year or 13-year period, I should say. Computing even below that, and engineering only staying at about 10%. So although there are these high-skill, high-wage, high-demand career areas where there's in some cases greater demand than there is even supply, there's still a gross underrepresentation of women and people of color. And then let's take an intersectional look in terms of equity gaps, and I would say absolutely as well as for women of color and women and men of particular racial and ethnic groups that we need to be mindful of as we're looking at our programs of study. And so in employing the PIPE process, our first step is to explore what we know from national trends as a lens to look at regional and local trends, as we then go to uncover and identify the reasons for those gaps. So what we do is we look at what we affectionately know as the 3 Ps: performance, participation, and pipeline in those programs of study from secondary to post-secondary areas. And what Perkins requires us to do is to set and meet specific targets around the participation and completion of students in programs that lead to what are called non-traditional occupations, or occupations where fewer than 25% of that gender is represented in the workforce. And so when we think about these occupations, manufacturing, engineering technologies, computer programming, logistics, health sciences, these are all many occupations where there are still gross underrepresentation of one gender over another. So with manufacturing, information technology, logistics, women are still grossly underrepresented, under 25%, in some cases even under 15 or 10%. And then in health sciences especially, men are underrepresented, especially men of color. And so when we look at data, gender may be our starting point, especially when we're looking at Perkins and looking at non-traditional occupational pathways. But it's critically important to also look at the intersection of gender with race and ethnicity, and with gender, with race, with ethnicity, and special populations, which includes students who are pursuing programs that lead to non-traditional occupational pathways, single parents, displaced homemakers, English language learners, which in the legislation is defined as limited English proficiency, individuals with a disability, and students who are economically disadvantaged. And then to look at that across time and to look at specific trends. And so in our work with states as well as districts and regions in the country, we use data dashboards to collect, or I'm sorry, to capture those data so that people can make meaning of them. So as you're looking at your data and identifying where those equity gaps are, the most powerful way to do that is to look at a granular level, to look at the program level. Don't just look at the institutional level. Don't just look at the full pipeline, but look specifically at the welding program. Look specifically at the computer programming program. Look specifically at the health technologies program and see where there are those equity gaps. And so if we think about where those are, some of the observations that were made by our colleagues included things like fewer women participating in computer sciences and computer-related pathways, especially Native American women. Looking at men's lack of participation in health sciences, especially at the certificate and associate degree level through community and technical colleges, especially men from historically underrepresented racial and ethnic minority groups, including African Americans, Latinos, Native American students, as well as lack of participation of women in logistics, in some areas of agriculture, and others. And so when we think about this, it's important to think about what data you might want to look at to see where those equity gaps are in your part of the country. Once we have an understanding of those gaps and we've explored that, then we can discover, uncover, identify more effectively the root causes for those. So I'm going to ask then for us to think about, what do you think are the key barriers to students pursuing these programs, especially these programs leading to non-traditional occupations, and especially these programs leading to high skill, high wage, high demand career pathways in the STEM sector? So observations included factors like access to specific courses and high quality STEM education, access to technology, financial constraints, issues around transportation, lack of role models and mentors, families' perceptions, the influence of peers, negative stereotypes from society. Many people observe that there's lack of information about specific careers, so students often will make decisions based on a limited field of what is out there just because they haven't been exposed yet and seen the relevance of that to their own interests. Other areas can reside around stereotype threat and how that might affect a student's belief in their ability to be successful at something and what they might attribute success or failure to. And so all of these different barriers can fit within a framework if we think about what we know from the literature. And we've got a tool that's available to people who are participating in today's webinar. And you can access this from our website as well by going to napequity.org/root, R-O-O-T. And it's called the Non-Traditional Career Preparation Root Causes and Strategies. And this is a summary of what we know from the field are the key barriers, the key root causes for students' participation in non-traditional career pathways to STEM jobs, especially when we think about those barriers for women. And it resides around the educational environment, so academic proficiency, access to and participation in particular STEM courses, the climate in the classroom, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I share with you some specific strategies that came out of a project in Roseburg, Oregon, in the southwestern part of that state. Lack of career information, which was an observation often made, and people's limited understanding of characteristics of particular careers. Lack of role models and mentors in which students see themselves mirrored and whose experiences might resonate with those students, where they can see, oh, okay, I can do that too, is often lacking. And then family perceptions, what might be specific to a particular community in terms of expectations that are based on what might be typical for a particular gender, or the strong cultural press that might exist more broadly around what jobs are appropriate and how that might affect students, and then ultimately the effect of all of that on the individual and how that then becomes internalized. So this is a tool that can help you as you're thinking about these root causes. And as you'll see, if you look on the left-hand side of this, you've got the theory on one side, and on the right-hand side, you've got the strategies that are most effective in addressing that. And I'll explain more about how to relate those as we get a little bit farther in the process. So what we know from a recent study, a comprehensive study that was done through funding from the Office of Career and Technical Adult Education, is this. Right now, the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education is engaged in a very exciting project that will be rolling out over the next few months, in which we've been involved since the beginning, called Advancing Equity in CTE. And out of that, on the Perkins Collaborative Resource Network, there's going to be a terrific literature review as well as a toolkit that people can access to help them in thinking through and thinking about and using these different resources. And so in looking at what we know are some of the key barriers to success, especially When we look at the underrepresentation of African American students, Latino students, Native American students in CTE, especially in STEM CTE, these are some of the key barriers. So stereotype threat, low expectations of teachers that are communicated to the students and internalized, inappropriate pedagogies that lack the incorporation of technology and ignore students' cultural experiences. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Instructional methods that fail to encourage or incorporate a connected and relational understanding, and lack of role models and mentors in whom students can see themselves mirrored. So as we think about these barriers, we can actually collapse all of these concepts into the notion or a construct called micro-messages or micro-messaging. And so I want to present to you a way to think about micro-messages and where we as educators can intervene in order to help to interrupt this negative cycle that we've been starting to talk about. So the first thing is to recognize that there are cultural stereotypes. Those cultural stereotypes lead to biases, which are communicated through micro-messages, small, subtle messages that are sent and equally as important, received, that can make an individual feel a sense of belonging, a sense of feeling valued, a sense of, this is for me, I can see myself doing this. Or on the flip side, a sense of, oh my gosh, this is not for me. This is not a place I want to be. I don't feel safe here, or I don't feel valued here, or my way of experiencing the world is not validated through this activity or through this program or through this pathway. And so what happens is that leads to an accumulation of advantage or disadvantage in given situations, which then affects a student's self-efficacy or their belief in their ability to be successful at something, which then leads to specific behavior. And the behavior is often that student drops out, stops out, does not continue in that particular pathway, or may not even consider it to start with. And so what we as educators need to do is interrupt this process at the point of micro-messages and replace these negative micro-messages that may in many cases be unintentional, but may have a major impact on students, with very intentional positive micro-affirmations to help affirm students in considering these pathways and pursuing them, and continuously build up their self-efficacy in that realm so that they can continue, persist, and be successful. And so when we think about cultural stereotypes in career technical education, these are images I pulled down from the web. So if you look at these images, these are different career pathways through CTE. And if you look at these different images, what do you see? Go ahead and react through the chat. What do you see? And let me ask you this, what white people? Yes, mostly white. So you see a cultural stereotype where you have mostly white people as examples from the field. What else do you see? Gender-defined roles. Yes. So you see people in roles that are gender typical, meaning often where the cultural press is. So a man going into automotive technology, a woman going into cosmetology, a man going into construction, a woman going into early childhood education, two men working with the Geek Squad, for example. Yes. What else do you see? What other stereotypes are being reinforced? Women in defined, everyone is happy. Yes. They love their jobs. Well, yes, and that may not be a bad thing to communicate. Using modern technology, that may also not be a bad thing to communicate. But we could also say that most everyone in these images is young. They're, not everyone can necessarily see themselves reflected. And so I want you to think for a moment and think about what are the stereotypes that are based on these cultural mores, this cultural press that exists, that may exist at your institution and have an impact on your students. Think about that for a minute. And I want us to then think about this idea as when there are these cultural stereotypes that lead to these biases, people make assumptions based on those stereotypes when they interact with someone who they perceive to be part of that so-called group. And so what happens is, as Chimamanda Adichie, who is a phenomenal writer, thinker, speaker, who we're going to hear briefly from in a moment, says, it leads to a single story. And the problem with a single story is a single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so I'm going to shift us over to taking a few minutes to listen to Chimamanda Adichie's well-known TED Talk. And if you haven't watched the whole thing, I encourage you to watch the whole thing. We're going to watch a few minutes of this to give us some food for thought of applying these concepts to our work with students in career technical education and STEM, especially when we think about working with underserved students. So I'm going to flip this over. And Allison, please let me know if the audio does not work. Can everybody hear okay? So I'm going to stop us there. And I encourage you all to continue to watch the rest of this fabulous TED Talk at another time. But I think it's given us a lot of wonderful food for thought. So when you think about the conversation that we've had thus far today, I want you to think about the stories that we often tell about our students and the cultural assumptions of their career interests, pursuits, appropriate pathways, and then the impact that that single story or those single stories and those cultural stereotypes might have on those students, their perception of self, and what direction they might go. And so I want to just open up for quick reflection from the group, your thoughts on that. Please use the chat function. I'm not seeing any reaction. So I will let you all think about that, reflect on that, and jot down your thoughts. Native students are traumatized and should be treated as victims is a stereotype that can definitely affect the experience of Native and Indigenous students. We generalize about the Latin community all the time. Students can do or be anything. Is that realistic? Interesting. We tend to tell students from different backgrounds about what we think of them instead of asking questions about themselves. That certain communities can get what they want as long as they work hard. Adult basic skills, students do not want to go to college after they earn their GED. Students in poverty cannot be successful. ELL students should go into CTE because they cannot be successful academically. So all of these different stereotypes become, in many cases, single stories that may affect the way those students experience the classroom, the educational environment, and their access to these pathways we've been talking about today. Good stuff. So when we think about cultural stereotypes being communicated through bias, those cultural stereotypes leading to bias, those biases are communicated through those micro-messages. Micro-messages being those small, subtle, unconscious messages that are sent and equally as important received when we interact with others. So if we think about the example of Chimamanda Adichie and her interaction with her American roommate at college, there were all sorts of unintentional micro-inequities that were sent by Chimamanda Adichie's roommate. They were unintentional, but lots of negative stereotypes were being reinforced. And so you can see, I mean, makes for a great story now, but that could definitely have a direct effect on a student, especially somebody who's in a completely new environment, who's going through culture shock, who's going through all of those challenges that might exist when someone goes into a particular situation. Somebody commented, you mean racist, ignorant, microaggressive statements? Sometimes they can be. Other times they can be something that someone is well-intentioned but does not recognize that because of implicit bias, because of these stereotypes being internalized without one recognizing it, they're actually inadvertently reinforcing stereotypes by the assumptions that they're making. Exactly, yes, intention versus impact was an observation by one of our colleagues. Bingo. So when we think about these micro-messages, they come in a number of different forms. They're verbal, they're paraverbal, how we say things, nonverbal, which is such a huge part of how we communicate. Contextual in terms of the way we set up an environment, the way we facilitate that environment, what images are on the wall, what examples are given in stories, what experiences are validated through our reading. All of those things are contextual, and equally as important by omission. So by what is omitted, we are also communicating a key message. And so are all your students' experiences being validated in the educational environment? And if not, where are there opportunities to expand that? Because it has a direct positive effect on everyone. And then how we give praise and criticism. And so when we think about this, this really accumulates over time and has a direct effect on a student's self-efficacy or their belief in their ability to be successful at something. And so when we think about this, self-efficacy is different from self-confidence. It is my belief in my ability to be successful at a task. It's a course, it's a program, it's a pathway, it's a career. And what we know is when a student has high self-efficacy, what does that look like? Well, they have higher achievement, there's greater interest, there's motivation, they're engaged, they persist, they perform. What we know is that an individual with high self-efficacy is more likely to adopt to and commit to challenging goals, which will help them in being successful in these career pathways we're talking about. On the flip side, when someone has low self-efficacy, that leads to doubt, fear, avoidance. It can be acting out and then ultimately stopping out or dropping out. And so with a student with low self-efficacy, much more likely to avoid challenges, especially if they're getting that accumulation of disadvantage in the particular environment. And so ultimately this affects a student's behavior. And so where we intervene is at the point of micro-messages. And so just as one of our colleagues just said, it's intent versus impact. So if the intention is positive or at least well-meaning, but because of those unquestioned biases can lead to a negative impact on a student, if we recognize that we've inadvertently absorbed those cultural stereotypes and then question those and begin to interrupt those in our own thinking, we can then be intentional and replace those negative micro-messages with positive and intentional micro-affirmations that build our student self-efficacy and can have a very powerful, positive impact on them. And so when we return to the PIPE process, what we've spent the last 20 minutes or so thinking about is that discover, that uncovering, that identifying those key root causes. But before we dive into strategies, it's important that we see whether what we're doing is having, or whether what our assumptions are indeed the biggest issues and whether there are any nuances we need to be aware of. And so that's where it's important to do some action research. So through the PIPE process, that can look, you can use surveys, you can use what's called an equity audit, looking at the educational environment, interviews, focus groups, all to see whether the assumptions about those root causes are indeed the key issues and whether there's anything else to consider. And then we select specific strategies that you know can mitigate the root causes that that work has identified and be effective in helping to remove those barriers for those students. And so if you look at the non-traditional career preparation root causes and strategies chart, which I referenced a little while ago, and that you can access from the website that you see right here on your computer, www.napeequity.org/root. The document itself is set up such that on the left-hand side is the theory, or each of those observations that you all made. So the barriers being issues of lack of academic proficiency, lack of access to and participation in particular courses, maybe lack of technology, lack of other important financial resources, transportation can be an issue, all those different things. So that's on the left-hand side. Then on the right-hand side are the strategies that we know from evidence and from the research are most effective in addressing those. And so that chart then becomes a tool that we can use to then look at what are most effective ways to address and mitigate these root causes. You can also use this information on the website, which goes into greater detail, and you can see the example with early intervention, which is one of those under career information, where there's theory and evidence behind this, and then at the bottom of this website are links to specific examples of folks who are doing this effectively. So then this becomes a tool that can help you as you're looking at specific strategies. When we think about the importance of students' experiences being validated in the classroom, another critical piece of the puzzle is making our work, making our programs, making our career technical pathways something that is culturally relevant to our students, where we are responsive and competent in understanding the different lenses that our students may bring to bear or bring into the classroom and into their educational experience. And thank you, Allison, for letting me know. We're doing just fine. So I'll be wrapping up very shortly. But I want to share with you all some specific strategies that are important to consider when working with Native American students and working with students who may come from cultural experiences where the experience of the group and the impact on the group is more important than that on the individual. So the lens that's brought may differ from the dominant cultural lens in American society. And so, for example, when we think about specific strategies, one is focusing on the group, so designing activities that are based on successful teamwork rather than individual accomplishment. Assigning group roles contrary to first instinct, meaning assigning group roles to individuals that may differ from the assumptions made by culture. So, for example, girls in high school, women in college are often the scribes, and boys or men are often the doers in a STEM lab, for example. So let's flip it on its head, because it's important that people get both opportunities, and especially those who may be getting pigeonholed into one area because of those cultural assumptions. Balancing cooperative activities along with the competitive ones and allowing students to grade based on cooperation. Encouraging and valuing sharing of information and knowledge, including that cultural knowledge. Having patience when it comes to time between questions, and modeling and teaching, noticing and listening first and then questioning, and creating a classroom welcome to listeners as well as talkers. There are different ways to think about time and the effects of time on learning, and so looking through multiple lenses. And then helping students to understand the relevance of what they're learning and explaining the value and purpose of that. And so what this gives us the opportunity to do is create communities of practice where we can talk about and have a safe environment in which to share with one another what's working, and also as we learn more and more how to be culturally responsive, be able to share that with our colleagues. And so let me give you an example of the way that PIPE has been implemented with Roseburg High School in southwestern Oregon. And you can see an illustration of how all these things come together. And there are a number of strategies within their approach that can be particularly useful in rural communities. And so what happened is, through this process, there was first the identification that there was a lack of girls' participation, the high school, in manufacturing pathways, and in particular in welding. And so they did extensive student surveys and teacher surveys and uncovered that there were a number of differences in the way students experienced the classroom. And they did what's called an equity audit. And what they identified was that all the welding equipment was size large. And so their strategies were fivefold, and they really built on one another. So one was first getting the welding instructors buy-in. The second was buying new welding equipment that was multiple sizes. Then they implemented a program called Freshman Cruise, where every freshman, every first-year student, had to go through each career technical program for a couple of days over a 2-week period. And the 4 girls in the welding program were put front and center and given as the example, given as the model, given as the role model and the mentor to the students, but especially the girls, to teach them how to do some of the basics when they were going through the welding lab. Then they did what's called Pride Night. It was a big open house for the career technical programs at the high school, where it then reinforced those same messages for the community, for the parents, for the siblings. And then they engaged in work using our Explore Non-Traditional Careers Toolkit, which helps educators to become aware of the ways in which implicit bias can create barriers to student success. So really coming at it from the standpoint of the contextual micromessages, So what's happening with equipment, contextual micromessages in terms of the lab and the environment, the educational environment, and then students' participation in and exposure to these different pathways, and then reinforcing that with parents and peers. And what happened is, it was very exciting, is they went from 4 girls in fall of 2015 in 1 semester after implementing this strategy to 38 girls in spring 16. In this past fall 16, they had 36 students enroll, so I think about 2 students decided not to continue. They had similar growth this past spring, and they're now anticipating as many as 40 girls to be participating in the welding program in the fall. So they've been able to really continue momentum as they've worked forward. And the reason I like this example is because it wasn't just one simple strategy. It was multiple strategies feeding on one another, addressing those key root causes that the action research identified and uncovered. And here's some images of students in that program, and you can see also how art was used as a way to get students excited about welding. So I wrote about this in the article that I told you all about, and you can read more about that. So as we look to some questions, I know we're running up against our time, and I hope that this extra time we spent together has been valuable, but reminding us of this importance of reflecting, anticipating, discovering, identifying, and then with offering, it's having high expectations of our students, helping them to believe that for us to believe that our students can meet those expectations, and helping our students then to know that we're going to work with them to get there. That's called that's called wise feedback, which is a powerful strategy to help in building student self-efficacy. So let me pass the baton back to our hosts today for any questions or reflections on our time together.
Hi, Ben. This is Sandra. Before we start with any questions, we did have some folks asking about access to resources and the slides. I know that there will be a recording of this webinar available on the IES website at some point, but what about the other materials and resources that folks might be able to access?
So the handouts for today include the non-traditional career preparation root causes and strategies, the super strategies for serving Native American students, and the PIPE article. I'm happy to send any individuals specific information about our work in more detail, and you can visit our website, napequity.org, where you can find information about our micromessaging cultural framework, as well as the program improvement process for equity. These slides won't be available as such, but the super strategies are summarized in the handouts and also on the website, and I'm happy to be a resource to anyone on today's webinar. How do we get connected to folks in Washington? Please email me. I would love to talk with you all. So, Sandra, were there any particular questions that came up?
We had one follow-up to the Roseburg example. Someone was interested whether the Roseburg group looked at intersectionality or just gender in their work.
So in their work, yes. So Roseburg is primarily a white, or the breakdown of, and when you look through the lens of race and ethnicity at Roseburg High School, is it's primarily a white institution, or primarily white students. When we looked at the data for that region and for the state of Oregon, it wasn't only through the lens of gender. So it was through the lens of gender, it was through the lens of race and ethnicity, and it was through the lens of special populations. And typically the data that are available are students with disabilities and students who are considered economically disadvantaged. So to the questioner's point, it is critical to look through an intersectional lens. So what we often start with is through the lens of gender, but then it's critically important to also look through the lens of gender and race, or gender and race and ethnicity, or gender and race and ethnicity in special populations to the extent that you are able. And especially in communities that are primarily white, you don't want your students of color to be left out and not to be considered, and whose voices may sometimes not be heard. And so it's critically important to be intentional about addressing those equity gaps as well.
Great, thank you, Ben. Allison, I'll let you let us know if we need to stop, but we did have some questions submitted before the event as well, and one of them was about addressing the M in STEM. Any connections or work with mathematics?
Well, certainly. So there's a deeply held but not at all validated stereotype in our country, especially relative to girls and women and mathematics and ability, in terms of women's ability to be successful in math. There's a negative stereotype that girls are not good at math as compared to boys, and that is just not true. It is not grounded in the research, it is not validated through the research, but one of the reasons why boys sometimes outperform girls is because they perceive that they might be better at math. And on the flip side, girls may internalize that negative stereotype, and then that may be reinforced through messaging and culture. You can get t-shirts about, you know, algebra is not for me, or whatever it might be, that is reinforcing that stereotype and becomes internalized for that individual. So that's a critically important cultural stereotype to interrupt and help build the self-efficacy of girls and women when it comes to mathematics. And mathematics is a key competency necessary in all areas of STEM.
Great, Ben. I just noticed a question about a couple terms that might have come up in our presentation today. And someone asked, what is the difference between a micromessage and a microaggression?
So if you think about a micromessage is neutral, right? It's a message that's sent and equally as important received. And then how that's received, I was defining as a micro inequity, which one could also call a microaggression, meaning that it leads to negative impact. It may be unintentional, but the impact may be very negative. Or on the flip side, a microaffirmation, which can make someone feel valued and included. And so there's extensive writing and talking about microaggressions in the academy, in business, in education, and that is definitely an important area to think about when it comes to micro inequities. Sometimes those aggressions are intentional. The reason why we use the term of micro inequity is because it may not necessarily be intentional, but because of these cultural stereotypes being unquestioned, because they kind of get absorbed without one's recognition through implicit bias, then that's why we use that term of micro inequity. Someone's saying that micro affirmations do not exist. Well, what we're saying in this case is that it's important for educators to recognize this cycle and be intentional about affirming students and mitigating those causes that we've been talking about today, those barriers that might exist, those micro inequities that may be discouraging students. So replacing those micro inequities with with intentional micro affirmations. That's what we mean by that. So I want to be mindful of time. We've already gone over a bit, but I want to share with you all a final quote, and then I'm happy to stay on a few more minutes if people are able and if our hosts are able. But I think this is a really powerful and important quote, and that is, the work that we've been talking about today is a process. It's a critical process. It can happen at the individual level, and it's very powerful when it happens at the group level, especially when you engage people across the educational environment, secondary, middle school, post-secondary partners, business and industry, community partners, and really looking at these dynamics to understand and address those barriers that exist to students so we can open up the full spectrum of what we know is out there and the great opportunities that are available. And so this process takes time, and I hope that you all walk away with a number of new tools that you can use, some specific strategies you can implement right out of the gate. But I want to leave you with this quote, because I find it always love hearing this. I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do something I can do. And so I thank you for spending some time together with us today. I hope this has been useful to you, and I hope that you will be in touch and connect with me and ask any additional questions you might have. Feel free to reach out to engage with the work that might be happening in your respective states. We're very active in the Northwest. I heard about Texas being represented today, and so would love to connect you to that work around the country. So thank you very, very much to our hosts for having me today.
Thank you, Dr. Williams and Dr. Stackless. This webinar recording will be made available online through the IES YouTube channel. In case your colleagues missed the webinar or you would like to watch it again, please monitor your email inbox for an announcement about the webinar's availability online. We will also send out a brief survey to capture your valuable feedback about today's webinar. We appreciate that you were able to join us today to discuss strategies to increase access and success for underrepresented students in CTE and STEM programs, and hope that you can join us for future REL programs and events. Have a wonderful day.